the 18th century. And the first person to come up with it was not a historian, not a biblical scholar. Ancient Jewish apologists, who certainly were antagonistic toward Christianity, never argue along these lines. Ancient pagan apologists against Christianity never argue along the lines that Jesus did not exist. In fact, to my knowledge, only one trained New Testament scholar argues along these lines, so far as I know, and even he's a little cautious. Now, I want to make a logical note here. I'm not arguing that the position is false because of the lack of ancient or medieval evidence of it existing, or because it's historically speaking a recent position. That would be the fallacy of arguing from silence or absence. You know, we can learn new stuff. We can get history better than we have it. We can understand it more precisely and clearly. Similarly, I'm not arguing that it can't be true because only one legitimate New Testament scholar holds it. That would be, or at least come close to, an ad populum fallacy. The majority is always right. But these are facts that you should know, and you should consider along with a number of other facts in historical investigation. So what I want to do in this presentation is briefly discuss the nature of historical investigation, and then talk briefly about the case for a non-historical Jesus. And this will not be all the things that all the people who say this sort of thing argue. And then critique briefly, and this will not be all the critique I have on these points. As a matter of fact, part of what made getting this presentation together so difficult was that when I looked at these ideas, I felt like a mosquito at a nudist colony. There was so much exposed flesh. It was a high target zone. But sometimes you do have to shoot fish in a barrel. And then I want to state the positive evidence for a historical Jesus, or some positive evidence for a historical Jesus. So I'll start with the nature of historical investigation. And oddly enough, a lot of historians don't understand history as history. Similarly, a lot of scientists don't understand science qua science, as science. And they should be grateful for philosophers of science and philosophers of history who come along and help those mere mortals who are great with math or who can read dusty books without sneezing. In the case of the historian, they should be grateful. So, how history should be done. The task of history, like science or detective work, is to provide the best explanation of the available data. And let's understand that historical conclusions are always tentative, that is, subject to revision. And when better explanations come along, they need to be revised. And historical conclusions are tested for their explanatory power. How well do they explain? By abductive or pragmatic criteria. Now, abductive reasoning is a lesser-known type of reasoning that was formalized by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. Now, Peirce didn't invent abduction. People have been doing it for as long as people have been around. But he did formalize it, and he helped philosophers and historians and scientists to think much more clearly about what they're doing. Abductive reasoning seeks to provide an explanatory hypothesis or to reason or make inferences to the likeliest explanation. That is, to answer questions such as, why is this so? So how do they test a historical theory or a hypothesis? Well, one test, and we're going to see it's a group of tests. One test is for coherence. Is the hypothesis consistent with everything or nearly everything that we hold true in a given field? Is it internally consistent? Does it contradict itself? That's a really bad sign if it does. And sometimes in areas like history, we have to say, is theory A more coherent than theory B? Which one is less incoherent? Another tool is simplicity, or as we saw in David Calhoun's talk yesterday when they had the clip from the Jodie Foster movie, Occam's Razor. And she stated it incorrectly, the simpler solution is always right. The simpler solution is not always right. There is a law of parsimony that says that we ought not multiply entities unnecessarily. We can think about it as the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. But there is also a law of sufficiency that says it is foolish to try to do with less when more is required. But on average, in general, most of the time, everything else being equal, the simpler solution is to be preferred. And one reason is that the less complicated your theory is, the less likely it is to be proven false. Simply because it has more complicated theories have more opportunities to be proven false. Another criterion is predictability. Does the theory help us predict future events? Now, this is particularly important in science. Einstein developed his theories of relativity and the mathematics behind it prior to confirming it, but because it was the sort of theory that made some predictions, particularly about what would happen in cases of eclipses, scientists knew that they could test it under the right conditions, and they could see that they were going to have the right conditions. And two teams went and tested it and found that actually what Einstein's theory predicted actually occurred. That was a good thing. And that happens in history as well. Happens in human personality. Greg talked about Columbo. A lot of episodes of Columbo, he'll be needling the suspect, just annoying him with question after question after question. But what Columbo's doing is he's figuring out what is he likely to do if he is guilty if I tell him this. And then oftentimes the final scene is that the person trying to cover his tracks gets caught trying to cover his tracks. So predictability is important also in history. Detective work, that sort of thing. Fruitfulness. Does the theory lead to new insights and discoveries? You may have loose ends in your understanding, but when you get a better hypothesis, frequently you go, oh, so that's what that does. Comprehensiveness. If you got two theories that are roughly equal, does one theory account for more of the relevant data or all of the relevant data? You see, coherency and simplicity are much more easily attained if you disregard some data. But your conclusion is also much more likely to be flawed. And here's another criterion, consistency. Does the conclusion have the ring of authenticity? Which does it more nearly resemble? A real-life explanation or a conspiracy theory? Would something highly out of the ordinary have to happen for which there is no explanation for this theory to work or to be true or preferred? So comparison is the key. Historical conclusions are arrived at by weighing various historical hypotheses according to these abductive criteria in order to arrive at the most plausible explanation. So the most important question is, which explanation is most likely to be true? So, let's look at some common mythicist arguments. One is that there are no reliable first-century non-Christian sources for Jesus' existence. Non-Christian. Another is that the historical Jesus does not appear prominently in any Christian source other than the New Testament Gospels. Why doesn't Paul tell us a great deal? Why doesn't he repeat the stories that we find in the Gospels? Why does Paul never talk about Jesus walking on water? Or feeding the multitudes with a few fish and loaves? Why didn't Paul seem to know about the Lord's Prayer? That sort of thing. The Gospels are also unreliable as historical sources, they will say. I'll say they're not entirely true. They'll say that the Gospels contain legendary tales or myths within them. Here's one. Nazareth did not exist. If Nazareth did not exist, then probably Jesus of Nazareth did not either. They'll also argue that many of the stories of Jesus have parallels in ancient mystery religions, Egyptian mystery religions, so forth. So Christianity is based on pagan myths. Well, let's look at some of these. What about this idea of no reliable non-Christian sources? One way mythicists argue their case is to insist that there are no reliable historical documents that mention Jesus from non-Christian sources. So we should either exclude what Christian sources say about Jesus or be highly skeptical of them when considering the question of Jesus' existence. Now, there's an immediate temptation to attempt to demonstrate that there are legitimate non-Christian sources that do speak of Jesus. And the good news is there are legitimate non-Christian sources that do speak of Jesus. But these sources, like Tacitus, Josephus, to name two, are not of the sort that they cannot be challenged. And the mythicists will insist that they have been corrupted. And I, for one, think that some of Josephus has been corrupted. And most evangelical New Testament scholars, historical Jesus scholars, think that parts of Josephus have been corrupted. Or that they're not contemporaneous with Jesus, that they were written too late, really to know, to be reliable. That's a temptation to say, okay, I think before we look at any of these sources, let's think about how we evaluate sources as sources. Let's ask this question. Is it reasonable to exclude a source just because it's a Christian source? See, what they've done is sort of a sleight of hand trick, like a magician who's effective at distraction. I love magicians. I can't do illusions or anything like that, but I love to see a good magician. And I know it's fake, but I still like it. And a good magician knows where to draw your attention so that he can do the illusion. And so they say non-Christians. So your mind is tempted to go, well, what about Josephus? What about Tacitus? And when you go there, you've given up this idea that Christian sources could be the best evidence we have. And that any historian worth his salt would see that and know that. So it's sort of a methodological sleight of hand. But there is an intuition behind it that seems correct. And the reasoning behind the claim is that we shouldn't accept that Jesus existed on the basis of a Christian source, because those making the claim are Christians. And the reason is that we fear bias. And bias is real. And we ought to do our best as historians to recognize bias when we can. So do you think maybe the mythicists themselves also have a bias? I think so. I think we all do. There are certain things that we all want to be true. But the fact that we want them to be true doesn't mean that they're not true. I believe my wife loves me. Matter of fact, I think she's nuts about me. Lucky woman. I know I'm nuts about her. I really want her. I really want that to be true. And the fact that I really want it to be true doesn't make it false. In order to be intellectually consistent, we, and by we I mean everyone, Christians, non-Christians, regular historians, mythicists, need to be as skeptical of our skepticism as we are of other people's beliefs. Everyone's biased about some things and to some degree. But this does not mean that everyone is disqualified from being a reliable source of information. The relevant question is, does their bias so influence them that they cannot or will not tell the truth on a matter? Who did the evangelists, those who wrote the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Now, as a historian, I say the evangelist. Sometimes when a New Testament scholar or a Jesus scholar says the evangelist, what he means is he doesn't think Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. I think the traditional gospel authors are the actual gospel authors. But I'm not going to argue that point to argue against this silly idea. I wish I really didn't have to do this, but it's an idea that is so weird, when people hear it, they don't really know how to respond. But who did they write for? Well, Luke tells us one thing, who he was writing for. He was writing for Theophilus. Simply put, it seems that the Gospels were written for Christians. So here's an idea. I am a Christian, and I'm going to write a book to deceive other Christians. You think that would be a good idea? You think that would ever really happen? No matter how biased I was. Furthermore, even when a source is recognized as biased, historians can still frequently make use of that source. They simply exclude some statements that have the earmarks of bias. Now, we've talked about Bart Ehrman more than once this week. I know Bart Ehrman. Bart's a friend of mine. We disagree on a lot of things. Bart's very smart. Bart's skilled in rhetoric. Bart doesn't think Paul wrote all the letters that I think Paul wrote. Bart doesn't think Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. Bart doesn't think that we can know that the New Testament text is reliable. I disagree with him on all those points. I think Bart's really biased. Bart wrote a book entitled, Did Jesus Exist? Arguing, yes, Jesus existed. And it's a stupid idea for anyone to put forward the idea that he didn't. Now, Bart's agnostic, leaning in the direction of atheism. Bart thinks the New Testament Gospels are not true in many places. And here's what Bart says about using them as historical sources. I should stress that I am not saying that Luke and the other gospel writers were trying to present disinterested accounts of the life of Jesus. They're biased. These authors were anything but disinterested, and their biases need to be front and center in the critic's mind when evaluating what they have to say. The fact that their books later became documents of faith has no bearing on the question of whether the books can still be used for historical purposes. To dismiss the Gospels from the historical record is neither fair nor scholarly. The relevant question, methodologically speaking, is why should I believe you? Historically speaking, the truly relevant question is whether or not someone is in a position, someone being the person making a report, where they are qualified to know what they're talking about and should be believed on a matter. I've heard of quantum physics, quantum theory. I know a little bit about the laws of thermodynamics. I know that the second law of thermodynamics is actually the third law. That's weird. I can't explain any of the laws of thermodynamics in mathematical terms. And scientific laws are formally expressed in mathematical terms. In many cases, such as political history or criminal investigation, our best sources are inside sources, which are almost always biased, but definitely in a position to comment on the events. This is why so often in courts of law we have witnesses who get immunity. But we don't give immunity to any old criminal. We give it to criminals who are in a position to know the truth. And they're certainly biased. And to remove that bias, we give them immunity so that the small fish can go free and we get the big fish. We ask this question all the time. How would you know? Here's an example, historically, of some significance. George Stephanopoulos. He wrote a book entitled All Too Human, best-selling book. It's a book about events that took place in the Clinton White House. George Stephanopoulos was in a position to know better than Bill O'Reilly. His position as a Clinton supporter and staff member qualified him to write on the Clinton White House. But if we applied the same standard, we say, well, there's no source that's not inside the Clinton White House, and therefore a supporter and biased. Here's what the publisher's summary on Amazon says. All Too Human is a new generation political memoir written from the refreshing perspective of one who got his hands on the levers of awesome power at an early age. At 30, the author was at Bill Clinton's side during the presidential campaign of 1992. And for the next 5 years, he was rarely more than a step away from the president and his other advisors at every important moment of the first term. It is an irreverent and intimate portrait of how the nation's weighty business is conducted by people whose egos and idiosyncrasies are no sturdier than anyone else's. And it's destined to become important, the most important and enduring book to come out of the Clinton administration. Or think about Socrates. Socrates, like Jesus, didn't write anything that we know of. And the only serious sources of information about Socrates that we have come to us from his students, Plato and Xenophon. Now, he's mentioned in a couple of plays, comedies, but plays are hardly serious sources of historical information. We really don't learn that much of historical significance from Friends or The Office. The charge that you shouldn't believe Christians on a matter simply because they're Christians is essentially the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is committed when one challenges a claim because of the claim's source rather than because of the claim's content or support. When someone attacks the source of a claim rather than the content of a claim, there's a problem. Here's an example. Now, I'm not an annihilationist. I'm not a conditionalist. But I've heard people argue the way this top statement is. We shouldn't take arguments for conditionalism seriously because that position is one that began with the Adventists and the Watchtower Society. Really? The truthfulness of a position does not depend upon who said it first, but rather whether or not it corresponds to reality. Or if we're talking about a hermeneutical question, whether the interpretation is consistent with Scripture. If it gets at the author's intention. A story I use is that belts were developed for warfare, so everyone who wears a belt is violent. The historical Jesus appears only in the canonical Gospels. Now, what they're saying is Paul doesn't really know about the historical Jesus. He knows the cosmic Christ. He had a visionary experience. He didn't know the earthly Jesus. Frankly, I find that very difficult to believe. Even if Paul had never converted, I would find that very difficult to believe. They were roughly the same age. Jesus went to Passover. I'm thinking maybe the Pharisee Paul was also in Jerusalem for Passover. That sort of thing. This claim is simply not true, and it's demonstrably false. Paul knows of Jesus and says some things about him in several places. But even if it were true, it wouldn't be relevant. Let me give you some examples of the things that Paul did know about the historical Jesus. Paul knew that Jesus was born. Now, let me give you a hint as historians and logicians. If he was born, he probably lived. Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. He knew he was a Jew, born under the law, concerning his son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh. He knew that Jesus had brothers. In Corinthians, he says, do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles? Apparently knew about Jesus' apostles. And the brothers of the Lord. And Cephas, he knew about Peter. Now, the point here, now something to get, is Paul's main point in the context of 1 Corinthians 9 is not, I know Jesus' brother and Peter. His point is the rights that they have, how they can be treated, and yet he doesn't hold on to his rights. It's not a historical point. It's a point about how they're going to do ministry. He knew that Jesus was crucified. Philippians 2:5-8. Now, do you remember Gary talking about forms that are delivered down to us? This is an early statement. Most scholars think it's a hymn or a poem that would have been used in Christian worship. Have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. He knew Jesus was executed at the instigation of Jewish leaders. Now, this is another passage where he's not so much going after the Jewish leaders as he's trying to encourage those who are suffering. For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea, writing to a Gentile church. For you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. They are not pleasing to God, but hostile to all men. Paul knew that Jesus was raised from the dead and that he appeared to a number of witnesses. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Now the mythicists will play on that. He gets it from the Old Testament. And that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, according to the Scriptures, except that's not in the Old Testament. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, And here's something that really gives you this sense of verisimilitude, that this is a real statement. Most of whom, by the way, remain until now. Some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. Paul knew that Jesus was a teacher. 1 Corinthians 11, the earliest record of the Lord's Supper. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." He's teaching theology. "Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." They will frequently stress, as liberals always do, that the Gospels are unreliable. They're not inerrant. This claim is not true. I believe the Gospels are inspired, infallible, and inerrant. But it's debatable. And we will never convince everyone of scriptural authority. But it's a red herring. A red herring is when you raise an irrelevant point. The issue is not inerrancy for the historian, but historical reliability, usefulness. Historians regularly make good use of sources that they do not consider entirely true in each and every respect. Simply put, even if there were false statements about Jesus in the gospel, that would not logically lead to the conclusion that Jesus didn't exist. That would be a non sequitur. And we've seen that from Bart Ehrman. He thinks there are lots of false statements in the gospel, and he also thinks that the gospels are the best sources we have for Jesus. There are legends and myths in the gospel. And many critical scholars, for example, Rudolf Bultmann, argue that some forms of material we find in the gospels must be demythologized. Bultmann thought that modern people couldn't believe in miracles. So whenever you come across a miracle story, you need to get rid of the miracle. Now, he thought ancient people were gullible. So virgins could have babies without having sex, which is what it means to be a virgin, by the way. But it's there in the text. The angel tells Mary, "You're going to conceive and have a child." And she goes, "I've always wondered how that worked." No. How can this be? So Bultmann's wrong. But regardless, even Bultmann never thought or wrote that Jesus did not exist. He said we can't know a lot. In one case, it's been translated, we can know next to nothing. Next to nothing is not nothing. He tells us a number of things that we can know, like Jesus was crucified. Jesus was reported to be a miracle worker. Jesus had conflict with the Jewish leaders. Those sorts of things. Even if there were myths about Jesus in the New Testament, that would not entail that Jesus himself was a myth. Let me give you an example. Consider George Washington. I don't for a minute believe that every story about him is true. He did not throw a silver dollar across the Potomac or cut down a cherry tree. Even the George Washington estate tells you that. But I don't conclude on that basis that George Washington himself was a legend or that he never existed. Now this one is really out of left field. Nazareth did not exist. Now we know where Nazareth is. But the way they will argue is that we have records of Nazareth located where? Where Nazareth is, prior to Jesus. Hundreds of years before Jesus. And we have records of Nazareth in the mid to late first century. But we don't have records of Nazareth in the teens, in the 20s, in the 30s, and I don't know what you call it, from AD 1 or BCE or CE 1 up to 10. And I don't know what to do about the year zero problem. It's just so funky. And the reason is that after that time, we begin to find rock-hewn tombs, what they call coke tombs. But we don't find any from 0 to 40, something like that. Well, that sort of tomb, only rich people could afford. And Nazareth was a poor place. Consider this. Barack Obama, have you heard of him? Have you heard that some people think he was not born in the United States? I'm not taking a poll. I'm not arguing that he wasn't. Okay? Even if he wasn't, that would not prove Barack Obama never existed. Furthermore, there's archaeological evidence that proves Nazareth existed in Jesus' day. We found coins and even a house from Jesus' day. I don't know if a house is as good as a tomb. Well, wait a minute. Living people live in houses. Maybe it is, I don't know. Parallels in ancient mystery religions. And this is something that we see in the Zeitgeist movie. You see it all over the internet. Let me say this. It's far more difficult to find legitimate evidence of ancient mystery religions that predate or that are contemporaneous with early Christianity than it is to find evidence of Jesus. Frequently, the mystery religion is created rather than discovered. Frequently, alleged similarities are found and important differences ignored. It's like the fallacy of saying a cloud and a watermelon are both 90% water. So I can fly a 747 through a giant watermelon. Or a cloud and a watermelon are the same thing. Here's what the great Albert Schweitzer said on this when people were talking about this related to Paul and Jesus. He says, almost all the popular writings fall into this kind of inaccuracy. They manufacture out of the various fragments of information a kind of universal mystery religion which never actually existed, least of all in Paul's day. Often the beliefs or characteristics that Christians supposedly borrowed came after Jesus, centuries after, in fact. Here's what the late Ron Nash had to say in his book, The Gospel and the Greeks. We find that there was no pre-Christian doctrine of rebirth for the Christians to borrow. The claim that pre-Christian mysteries regarded their initiation rites as a kind of rebirth is unsupported by any evidence contemporary with any such alleged practices. Instead, a view found in much later text is read back into earlier rites, which are then interpreted quite speculatively as dramatic portrayals of the initiate's new birth. The belief that pre-Christian mysteries used rebirth as a technical term is unsupported by even one single text. And here's what Sir Norman Anderson said on the matter. He said, "If borrowing there was by one religion from another, it seems clear which way it went. There is no evidence whatever that I know of that the mystery religions had any influence in Palestine in the early decades of the first century." So, what we've done is we've looked at how history should be done. We've looked at some of their arguments, and we've shown that they're pretty flimsy and some of them just outright illogical. But we really need some positive evidence. So I'm way behind, but I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to do a minimal facts argument like Gary Habermas, except I won't be walking all over the stage talking about hockey. And in what follows, I'm adopting a minimal facts method. I will only argue from what the vast majority of critical scholars hold to be the case. What we call the synoptic problem gives us really good reason to think Jesus existed. Now, the synoptic problem, or the synoptic question, comes up because New Testament scholars recognize that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar. John's not similar to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And yet they've got some differences. And how do you explain the history of these documents? Well, the New Testament Gospels were based on earlier written sources that are no longer extant, that no longer survive. And the reason scholars think this is that many places it's the exact same word. And it's the same order. But we don't need critical scholars to tell us that they use sources. Luke does that. First verse in the book of Acts, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account. Now, this Greek phrase here sometimes is translated a consecutive account. It doesn't mean chronological account. It means an orderly account. For you, most excellent Theophilus. So let's look at what textual, critical New Testament scholarship, liberal to mainline scholarship says. Critical scholars agree that Mark was the first gospel and that Matthew and Luke at points used Mark to write their gospels. So Matthew and Luke had Mark, copied Mark at points. No problem with that. Luke tells us. He used lots of sources. They also agree that there was another source that Matthew and Luke used. This now lost source is called Q, short for Quella, source in German. Q is the material that Matthew and Luke have in common that's not in Mark. There is other material in Matthew that is not found in Mark or Luke or Q. This unique material in Matthew must have come from some other source or sources, and this material we call M. Luke also has unique material that is not found in Mark or Q or Matthew, and this we call L. So this is a four-source hypothesis, and it makes good sense. Critical scholars date Q, written document, to the 50s, with M and L probably coming shortly thereafter. So, we have written sources about Jesus in the 50s. Not the Gospels, according to critical scholars. Mark coming soon thereafter. Now, all this relates to what scholars call source criticism. So it's dealing with written documents. And they look for signs of literary dependence in order to ascertain, hypothesize how the synoptic gospels took the form that they have. But critical scholars agree that these written sources came from oral traditions. Form critics. How many of you seminary students have heard of form criticism? Form critics. You can write on your New Testament intro exam, form criticism studies the oral traditions behind the stories. Don't really know what it looks like when you see it, but that's all you need for the test, right? Form critics seek to understand the history of the oral tradition. Tradition being a very important word, but behind the written sources, Q, L, and M. Now, this task is called form criticism because the different types of stories in the synoptic gospels have a common form to them that reveals a standardized way of telling these stories. So you have a miracle story. What happens? A sick person comes to Jesus, or a dead person, and Jesus interacts with the person or the people that bring the sick or dead person. And then Jesus does something dramatic, and God is glorified. In some of the Gospels, there may or may not be this part about don't tell anybody, what we call the mark in secret. But it follows a pretty standard form. It's not word for word, it's not verbatim, but there's this form that we see. Conflict stories. Jesus deals with Jewish leaders, and Jesus always wins, right? I mean, Jesus is pithy. I mean, Jesus is like the Stephen Colbert of first century Judaism, all right? And they recognize these forms. And it's these oral forms that Q and M and L come from. Now, if Q dates to the 50s and these standardized oral forms must be even earlier, say the 40s or very early 50s. But these standardized forms didn't come to be standardized overnight. They're the result of a process of telling and retelling even earlier, non-standard or informal oral stories about Jesus. So if the forms date to the 40s or very early 50s, then the informal stories from which they come must date to the 30s or very early 40s. 30s. Now, tell me again what decade this alleged Jesus was supposed to have died in? But critical scholarship can also give us some pointers not only as to when these stories began to be told, but also where they began to be told. And that's because these stories have some signs of originating in Palestine, even in the Gospels. Not the earliest stories, not the forms, not Q, L, Mark. Carry on into Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, even. We know this because they retain key phrases in Aramaic, which have to be translated into Greek. You remember Jesus healing the little girl, Talitha Kumi? You remember Jesus on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani? Why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? But Greek is the lingua franca of the ancient Mediterranean world. The Gospels are written in Greek. Aramaic is the language of Palestine. Now, these bits then are likely to be very early because they likely predate the Christian missionary movement. This then would be the late 30s Palestine. Where and when was this alleged Jesus supposed to have lived and died and been resurrected? Was it Palestine? Yeah. Where do the earliest scholars agree that the earliest church began? Scholars are virtually unanimous that Christianity began as a Jewish messianic movement. In this regard, Christianity was not unique. Luke tells us in Acts 5 that Jesus was not the first Jew to claim to be the Messiah. Josephus tells us this as well, and other ancient historians. And Jesus' death was not historically unique in this sense either. If you were designated a Messiah, or if you claimed to be the Messiah, don't put your money away. Don't take out a 401k, okay? You're just not going to need it. Here's what N.T. Wright says about Jewish messiahs and Jesus of Nazareth. If nothing happened to the body of Jesus, I cannot see why any of his explicit or implicit claims should be regarded as true. What is more, I cannot, as a historian, see why anyone would have continued to belong to his movement and to regard him as its Messiah. There were several other messianic or quasi-messianic movements within 100 years either side of Jesus. Routinely, they ended with the leaders being killed by the authorities or by a rival group. If your Messiah is killed, you conclude he was not the Messiah. Some of those movements continue to exist. Where they did, they took a new leader from the same family. But note, nobody ever said that James, the brother of Jesus, was the Messiah. Such groups did not go around saying their Messiah had been raised from the dead. The early Christians did believe that Jesus had been raised bodily from the dead. What is more, I cannot make sense of the whole picture historically or theologically unless they were telling the truth. You see what he's doing here? He's telling a story. He has a hypothesis about how to make sense of the fact that the early Christians did something weird. So, how likely is it that a Jewish messianic movement that began in Jerusalem in the 30s had no historical person that they believed to be the Messiah? Still, it's possible that Jesus never existed. But how would it be the case that so many people for so long have believed that Jesus of Nazareth was an actual historical figure? But it's possible. Now, I'm going to mention a movie that David did not mention yesterday, with good reason. I think every time you watch this movie, you lose 2 IQ points. Dumb and Dumber. You remember that scene where Jim Carrey, who's got this crush on Lori, says, "What are my chances?" And she says, "Not good." "You mean like not good as in 1 in 100? And she says, "I mean like not good as in 1 in 1,000,000. And Jim Carrey says, "So you're saying I got a chance?" I think I hear Jim Carrey's voice in this hypothesis. Now, 2 options. Let's grant that it's possible. So how did this happen? How did we get a Jewish messianic group without a Messiah to believe in? Well, either they accidentally misunderstood the sort of literature they were dealing with. So we probably really didn't even have a Jewish messianic group. So not only Jesus didn't exist, earliest Christianity didn't exist. They thought mythological literature was actually history, historical narrative, biography. Or, secondly, they were deceived by scoundrels. So let's consider the accidentally misunderstood. Mythicists insist that writings about Jesus were like those of the Egyptian deities or divine men myths of the later mystery religions. But Christianity began as a sect of Judaism, as a relatively common sort of sect, a messianic group. And Second Temple Jews were very careful not to allow themselves to become polluted by pagan religions. They had learned their lesson from the exiles. They would not write like pagans. And the gospel stories are narratives, not the sort of religious writings that pagan mystery religions and so forth typically wrote. They weren't like Greek writings either. They weren't like Roman writings. Now, Paul's letters are somewhat like that, but not the Gospels. When people tell me, what about those alternative Gospels? The first question I ask them is, have you read them? Or I might say, well, which one of them do you like? And what do you like about it? And most of the time, the Starbucks skeptic, he's just heard about them. He's never read them. And the best thing to get somebody over liking these other gospel, quote, other gospels, unquote, is have them read them. And they don't seem remotely like history. They don't seem remotely Jewish. Well, what about being deceived? Well, this is possible, but exactly who is doing the deceiving? Well, it's not the earliest Christian leaders, Peter, James, and Paul. They all died for their belief in Jesus. That didn't work out for them. Now, men die for lies, but they don't die for lies that they know are lies. And note, apostles. One of the qualifications for being an apostle was that you had actually seen Jesus. And who would stand to gain from such a plot? Well, not Peter, James, and Paul, not the Jewish leaders, not the Romans. So I ask again, just who is behind this deception and why? Still, it's possible that Jesus never existed, just like it's possible we never landed on the moon, or that George Bush blew up the levees in New Orleans, or that the U.S. government was behind 9/11. I think I have found a form, the conspiracy theory. But is it more likely than the hypothesis that Jesus actually existed in a known type of Jewish messianic movement? Is it equally coherent? Is it simpler? Is it more fruitful? Is it more comprehensive? Is it more consistent? I think not. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions? All right, Pancho. Hello. You have to say it right. All right. Did I go so long it just wore out another battery?
Hello.
I got started late.
So texting back and forth with my skeptic cousin, he wanted to ask, how is it that the Romans, who kept excellent records, did not have any record of this person that they publicly killed?
All right. How is it that the Romans, who kept excellent records, don't have records of most of the people they killed? I mean, not individual records. You know, Jesus came from working class family in a poor area. And it's really remarkable that we have records of any peasants from that time in history. And maybe Pilate had some poor record keepers. He didn't do a good job in other ways either. So, question?
You cited N.T. Wright, and having read N.T. Wright, a lot of N.T. Wright, I've found him very beneficial in me understanding the first century. And I would ask, what do you believe is N.T. Wright's greatest contribution to New Testament studies, and what would you, I guess, advise we take as a grain of salt, or if that makes sense?
All right. Well, that's a question that doesn't really have anything to do with whether Jesus existed or not. So let's step into the Tom Wright seminar. I've heard of Tom Wright. And I would say Tom Wright is a giant and will grow larger as time goes along in New Testament scholarship. Richard Hayes said that no one since Bultmann had attempted a project like Wright's project. Wright is going to tower over other contemporary New Testament scholars. He already does. And he really is a Pauline scholar, first and foremost. But he's probably also the world's foremost Jesus scholar. Where to take Wright with a grain of salt? Well, his view of hell is unclear. What he says in Surprised by Hope. What goes on with those who don't know Jesus? It's a little murky. I think he could do better in stating that. His view of justification and salvation, ordo salutis, is highly controversial, particularly with old line Reformed theologians. Although many Reformed theologians are being won over, and I haven't read his little pamphlet that just came out, and so I think I'll just hold off there. The main area where I've studied Wright has been historical method, his philosophy of history, and Jesus studies. Yeah.
Okay, two quick questions. One, I had heard that the Romans were good at keeping records of their census, and apparently there were no records of the census that brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem.
Okay.
I was wondering, do we have a record of that?
All right. Okay, now number one, that would be irrelevant to whether Jesus existed or not. Mm-hmm. Number two, the dating there is just very squishy. There are some ways to read. There are different ways of reading it. One of our problems with that passage is that the King James says more than the Greek says, and that's a huge problem. I love the King James. It's lasted longer than probably any modern translation ever will, but it does have some defects. It's good news for medieval man. But I think I've said about all that I'm going to say on that point.
Okay, the other one, which was relevant to whether Jesus existed, I had heard a couple of months back that some man, I can't remember his name, said that he'd found some ancient Roman historical document that said that the Romans made up Jesus in order to quiet down certain Jewish sects who were waiting for this great messianic king
Yeah,
coming, and
yeah.
they did this to
Yeah.
like quiet them down, so they had a peaceful Messiah. I was wondering
Yeah.
if you'd heard about that.
I heard about it, and,
Yeah.
and it's been pretty much discredited,
Okay.
and kind of like Secret Mark, or the Norton Smith fragment. Morton Smith fragment. So
Okay.
there
Thanks.
you go. Well, it's appropriate to close with hello.
Hello.
Okay.
You had mentioned that the Second Temple Jewish people were really particular about not allowing pagan beliefs into their system of beliefs. And I've never heard of that, so I started thinking. It's like, okay, what ways would my atheist friends kind of try to counter that? And I thought that, so maybe the original Jewish people, or the Jewish Christians, kept their religion pure, but then once the Greeks came in, then maybe they started polluting it and so forth.
Mhm.
Do you think that there's any kind of basis to that, or how would you counter that?
Well, Greek was like English is today.
Yeah.
And I think that early Jews knew about a lot of things that were Greek. But they were very committed to their ways, and very committed to being pure in their Judaism. And here's the thing anthropologically. When a people are in bondage, when a people are being abused, they circle the wagons. And the Jews in the Second Temple period were not in a great situation. They'd been in worse situations.
Right.
But they really, they probably would like to have been treated like second-class citizens, most of them. But they really had this sense of we are oppressed. And that's what people groups do in that situation. And so, yeah, they were aware, but they just weren't buying it. And we see it. There's rebellion after rebellion after that's why Jerusalem is sacked in AD 70 and the temple is destroyed. And then we had the Bar Kokhba rebellion come along 50 or 60 years later. We'd had the Maccabees previously. Those Jews, they didn't like being ruled by other people, and when they could do something about it, they tried to. And so that was their situation, and they were very protective and very guarded, much more so than, say, Americans are about pagan ideas coming in today.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. Where's my wife? You have something? Okay, I'm going to give out stuff. And it ain't for you. You know, this sort of event doesn't happen because of one or two people. It takes a lot of people working really hard to pull it off. And I said earlier, Andrew does most of the work that I take credit for, and I really meant it, so come on down, Andrew. But Andrew's not the only guy. Zach Milstead, Alex Bryan, Michael Sykowski. Is Jennings here? Is Vicky here? Vicky Gordy?
I don't think Vicky's here.
Okay. Well, we got some gift certificates. Chris Schaefer here? Is Lenny Price here? This is the man who made this place not like a meatpacking plant. I sent Lenny a text. I really did stay up all night. And I sent Lenny a text message. I got up here to the Price Center, and the door into this room was locked. So I sent him a text message, and I said, "The door is locked." And he texted back, "Try knocking on it. Maybe somebody inside will let you in." I am an intellectual. All right, I know I'm forgetting some people. Help me out, Andrew. Josh Freeman, where's Josh? Is he driving people to the airport? Okay. Rabbi Freeman.
What's this conference about? I've never been to it yet.
All right, who else am I forgetting? Because I've got gift cards left over. Chris. Well, I'll figure it out then. Oh, Jake, come on down.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, I appreciate you so much. And next year, Ryan is going to be running this event.
Let me stop you right there, Dr. Stewart.
All right.
I have a presentation I would like to make. Some of us prepared this, and we found a photo that encapsulated the spirit of what's happening here, and we decided
this
we
can't
would.
be good.
Oh, it's not. And we decided we would sign it, and we're going to put the picture on the screen as well. But there you go. It's from all of us on your last Defend the Faith as our director.
Well, that's not too bad.
It's not too bad. Oh, it's kind of saying you've finished the race
Yeah.
for ICA.
Yeah.
And
Not ICA, just Defend the Faith.
Defend the Faith, not ICA, right. And I know that there's a lot of you who would like to also...
That is the Boston Marathon.
Really? In New
Yeah,
Orleans.
that's my story, and that's the ticket.
If you also would like to, you say, hey, I didn't get to sign the picture. If you would like to send warm greetings and soft apologetics to Dr. Stewart, you can do so on, I would say, leave him a note on his Facebook page or tweet him something on @DrBobStewart and let him know how much we appreciate him. Let's have a hand for Dr. Stewart.
Oh. As N.T. Wright would say, Americans give standing ovations so easily. All right. Well, thanks. We hope that you'll be praying for us. We hope that you may put some feet to your prayers. But, and God willing, we'll see you next year. God bless. Yeah.